The afternoon of November 23, 1943, broke clear over Tarawa Atoll in the Gilbert Islands. Lieutenant Junior Grade Hamilton McWhorter sat in his Grumman F6F Hellcat at 12,000 feet, leading his division on combat air patrol above the invasion fleet below. The radio crackled with reports of incoming Japanese aircraft. McWhorter's division dropped altitude, scanning the horizon for the enemy formation. Then he saw it. A single Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, skimming low over the water, trying to use the ocean as cover from American radar and fighters. McWhorter rolled his Hellcat into position, came in on the bomber's starboard beam, and fired a single 1-second burst from his .650 caliber machine guns. The port engine erupted in flames. The Betty hit the water and burned. When McWhorter's Hellcat touched down on the USS Essex later that afternoon, the armourers counted his ammunition expenditure, 86 rounds. His squadron mates started calling him One Slug McWhorter, and the nickname stuck. But something far more significant had just occurred. Hamilton McWhorter had become the first pilot in history to achieve ace status flying the Hellcat. 5 confirmed kills. And the Japanese Navy was about to learn that this wasn't luck, it was a pattern. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Pacific War's early years had been a nightmare for American naval aviators. The Mitsubishi A6M dominated the skies from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines, racking up kill ratios that made American commanders desperate for a solution. Japanese pilots possessed hundreds of combat hours over China, and their aircraft could outturn, outclimb, and outmaneuver nearly everything America fielded. The F4F Wildcat was tough and reliable, but it couldn't match the Zero's performance. American pilots survived through tactics, through their discipline, through formations like Lieutenant Commander John Thatch's famous weave pattern. But tactics could only compensate for so much. The kill ratios told the brutal story. Japanese aces were accumulating victories, while American squadrons bled experienced pilots they couldn't afford to lose. Squadron commanders sent urgent requests back to the States. We need a fighter that can compete on performance, not just clever maneuvering. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation was already working on the answer. Every after-action report from the Pacific, every pilot debrief, every intelligence assessment fed into the design process at Grumman's Bethpage, New York facility. Engineers analyzed what worked and what didn't. The Wildcat's ruggedness worked. Its protected fuel tanks worked. Its ability to absorb punishment worked. But speed and climb rate needed dramatic improvement. The urgency was palpable throughout 1942. While the Navy achieved strategic victories at Midway and during the Guadalcanal campaign, tactical air combat remained desperately challenging. Pilots reported that Zeros could choose when to engage and when to break off, simply by outclimbing American fighters. That altitude advantage translated to energy advantage, which meant life or death in aerial combat. The pilot who controlled the vertical dimension controlled the fight. Grumman's design team approached the F6F Hellcat with a philosophy that would define American wartime engineering. Build what works, not what's elegant. They took every lesson learned from Wildcat pilots in the Pacific and translated it into specifications that prioritized combat effectiveness over aesthetic beauty. The result was an aircraft that looked brutish and workmanlike because that's exactly what it needed to be. The heart of the Hellcat was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, an 18-cylinder radial powerhouse producing 2,000 horsepower. This wasn't incremental improvement over the Wildcat's 1,200 horsepower Wright Cyclone. It was a fundamental leap that changed what a carrier fighter could do. That massive engine, spinning a 13-foot Hamilton Standard propeller, gave the Hellcat a power-to-weight ratio that finally matched Japanese fighters. But raw power meant nothing without proper application. Grumman engineers obsessed over every detail that combat reports identified as critical. They designed the Hellcat's wing with careful attention to stability during high-speed climbs, while maintaining controllability. The wing measured 42 feet across and incorporated hydraulically folded outer sections for carrier storage, a critical feature that let each carrier pack more fighters below deck. Every design choice served multiple purposes. The airframe structure used heavy-gauge aluminum with redundant load paths, meaning battle damage that would down a zero might leave a Hellcat still controllable. Navy pilots called it the aluminum tank with genuine affection. The aircraft weighed 15,213 pounds, fully loaded for combat, nearly 3 times the Zero's weight. Yet it matched or exceeded Japanese climb performance while providing protection that saved countless American lives. The cockpit layout reflected lessons from combat veterans. Instruments were logically arranged for quick scanning during combat maneuvers. The gun sight was a Mark 8 reflector type that projected an illuminated reticle onto an angled glass plate, letting pilots aim without losing sight of their target. Throttle, mixture, and propeller pitch controls fell naturally under the pilot's left hand, while the stick in his right hand featured a trigger for the guns and a button for radio transmission. Everything was designed for a pilot who might be pulling high-G maneuvers while trying to track a maneuvering target. 6 Browning 50 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, carried 400 rounds per gun. That's 2,400 rounds total. When a Hellcat pilot squeezed the trigger, all 6 guns fired simultaneously, delivering a stream of heavy projectiles that could soar through aluminum airframes, shatter engines, and disintegrate control surfaces. The Zero typically carried only 2 20mm cannons with limited ammunition and 2 7.7mm machine guns. While the cannon packed a harder punch per shell, the limited ammunition meant Zero pilots had to be selective. Hellcat pilots could afford longer bursts, and the sheer volume of 50 caliber rounds made hitting targets easier. Testing began in June 1942, when the XF6F1 prototype first flew from Grumman's Bethpage facility. Initial results were promising but not spectacular. Grumman swapped in the more powerful R2800-10 engine variant for the XF6F3 prototype. That aircraft flew on July 30th, 1942, and immediately demonstrated the performance characteristics the Navy desperately needed. By October 1942, the Navy ordered production to begin even before completing all testing phases. The Pacific Fleet couldn't wait for peacetime procurement timelines. The first Hellcats reached the Pacific Theater in January 1943, assigned to Fighting Squadron 9 aboard the USS Essex. Pilots transitioning from Wildcats immediately noticed the difference during carrier qualifications. The Hellcat's longer landing gear absorbed deck impacts better. The wider track made it more stable during takeoffs, and that massive engine pulled them off the deck with authority that inspired confidence. But combat performance remained theoretical until Japanese pilots provided the real test. That test came on August 31st, 1943, during Operation Rugged over Marcus Island. Fighting Squadron 5 from the USS Yorktown and Fighting Squadron 9 from the Essex launched their Hellcats as part of a carrier task force strike. The operation's objective was straightforward: hit Japanese installations and draw out their air forces to test American strength. What the Japanese pilots encountered that day fundamentally challenged their understanding of American fighter capabilities. When Japanese Zero pilots attempted to climb after breaking American fighters, something unexpected happened. The Americans climbed away, maintaining or increasing separation rather than being overtaken as Wildcats had been. Combat reports from that day described the confusion Japanese pilots experienced. One Zero pilot attempting to pursue a Hellcat, after an unsuccessful deflection shot, found himself steadily losing ground as both aircraft climbed. The American fighter simply pulled away in the vertical, maintaining a climb angle the Zero couldn't match while carrying full fuel and ammunition. When the Zero pilot pushed his climb to the limits, his airspeed dropped dangerously low, and another Hellcat dove on him from above. The vertical trap had claimed its first victims. The engagement resulted in relatively few aircraft losses on both sides, but the tactical intelligence gained was invaluable. Japanese commanders received detailed debriefs from surviving pilots, and those reports contained troubling information. The new American fighters possessed climb performance that matched or exceeded the Zero. Despite being visibly larger and heavier aircraft, they carried heavier armament, as evidenced by the destructive power of their guns. And most concerning, American pilots were flying with disciplined tactical coordination rather than the individual aggressiveness that had characterized earlier combat. By September 1943, Hellcats were spreading across the Pacific Carrier Fleet. Fighting Squadron 1, Fighting Squadron 2, Fighting Squadron 5, Fighting Squadron 6, and Fighting Squadron 9 all transitioned to the new fighter. Each squadron brought back similar reports after their first engagements. The Japanese were probing, testing, trying to understand this new opponent's capabilities and limitations. Japanese intelligence officers compiled reports from multiple engagements throughout September and October. Pilots consistently mentioned the American fighter's ability to climb rapidly and maintain energy in vertical maneuvers. The reports used terms like unexpectedly powerful and difficult to pursue in climbing combat. Japanese Naval Aviation Command began circulating tactical bulletins, but changing ingrained doctrine and training would prove far more difficult than simply warning pilots about a new threat. The stage was set for the systematic exploitation of vertical superiority. American squadron commanders quickly recognized they had a weapon that could fundamentally change Pacific air combat. The Hellcat's climb rate wasn't just a performance statistic. It was a tactical advantage that invalidated decades of Japanese fighter doctrine. Commander David McCampbell, who would become the Navy's top ace with 34 confirmed kills, described it perfectly during squadron briefings. "We don't fight their fight anymore. We make them fight ours, and our fight happens in the vertical." The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. A Hellcat at sea level could reach 10,000 feet in approximately 4 minutes of sustained climbing while maintaining an airspeed of 160 knots. A Zero attempting the same climb would arrive seconds later, but with lower remaining airspeed, meaning less energy for maneuvering. Those seconds translated to positional advantage, and position was everything in air combat. The American pilot reached altitude first, could observe the developing situation, and could choose whether to engage or climb higher. Squadron training throughout late 1943 hammered these concepts into every Hellcat pilot. The tactical doctrine was called fast and high, and it required discipline that didn't come naturally to aggressive young aviators. When a Zero appeared below you, every instinct screamed to dive immediately and engage. But the doctrine demanded patience. Maintain altitude. Observe the enemy's energy state. Wait for the optimal moment, then dive with tremendous speed. Make your firing pass. And here's the critical part. Resist the temptation to turn and chase. Instead, use that diving speed to climb back to altitude, extending away from the enemy while regaining your positional advantage. Japanese pilots found themselves in an impossible situation. Their training emphasized turning combat, where the Zero's 16-second turn radius at 230 knots gave them superiority over nearly every opponent they'd faced. But Hellcat pilots simply wouldn't turn. A Zero pilot might execute a perfect reversal, pulling his aircraft through a gut-wrenching turn that would make any pre-war instructor proud, only to find his target already 1,000 feet above him and climbing away. Pursuing meant bleeding energy in a climb where the American held the advantage. Not pursuing meant conceding the initiative entirely. The vertical trap worked because it forced Japanese pilots to make losing choices: engage in the climb and accept inferior performance, or maintain altitude and allow Americans to dictate engagement timing. Some experienced Japanese pilots adapted by trying to stay above American formations, but Hellcats could be prepositioned at altitude specifically to counter this. Combat air patrols now stationed themselves at 20,000 to 25,000 feet, altitudes where the Hellcat's two-stage supercharged engine still delivered strong performance, while Japanese engines struggled with thin air. Lieutenant Alex Vrasiu, who flew with Fighting Squadron 6 and would finish the war with 19 confirmed kills, explained the psychological impact during post-war interviews. Japanese pilots had spent 2 years controlling the terms of engagement. They chose when to fight based on positional advantage. Now that control shifted entirely to American pilots. Vrasiu described encounters where Zero pilots would attempt aggressive head-on passes, hoping to score quick kills, then break away and dive to escape rather than risk climbing combat. The hunted had become the hunters. The mathematics of energy management underpinned everything. When a fighter climbs, it trades kinetic energy for potential energy, converting speed into altitude. The rate at which an aircraft can make this conversion while maintaining controllability defines its vertical performance. The Hellcat's power-to-weight ratio, combined with its efficient wing design, meant it could sustain this conversion longer and more effectively than the Zero. A Hellcat pilot who started a climb with 300 knots of airspeed could reach 15,000 feet while maintaining enough speed to maneuver. A Zero pilot attempting the same climb would arrive slower, more vulnerable, and out of position. By December 1943, engagement after engagement confirmed the pattern. Japanese after-action reports increasingly mentioned American fighters that refused combat or withdrew upward when approached, which was Japanese interpretation of American vertical fighting. But these weren't withdrawals. They were tactical repositioning moves that consistently resulted in American advantages and Japanese losses. The implications of this tactical revolution were beginning to dawn on Japanese commanders. For 2 years, their doctrine had been built on the foundation of the Zero's superiority in turning combat. Now, American pilots had found a way to make turning combat irrelevant. The Hellcat wasn't just a better aircraft. It was an aircraft designed specifically to exploit the weaknesses Japanese fighters couldn't fix. The Zero achieved its legendary agility by sacrificing protection. It had minimal armor, plating, and no self-sealing fuel tanks. A single burst of machine gun fire could ignite a Zero's fuel tanks, turning the aircraft into a fireball. Grumman built the Hellcat with heavy armor plate behind the pilot's seat, armored glass in the windscreen, and self-sealing fuel tanks that would automatically seal bullet holes. Hellcats could absorb tremendous battle damage and still bring their pilots home. This durability gave Hellcat pilots confidence to press attacks aggressively, knowing their aircraft could take punishment. The strategic picture was shifting. American industrial capacity was producing Hellcats at rates Japan couldn't match. At peak production in March 1945, Grumman's Bethpage facility delivered 605 aircraft in a single month. That's an average of more than 20 Hellcats per day. This industrial achievement meant American carriers never lacked aircraft, regardless of combat losses. Every damaged Hellcat could be replaced within weeks, sometimes days. Japanese factories, by contrast, struggled to replace losses at all. The combination of superior aircraft, superior tactics, better trained pilots, and overwhelming numbers was creating a situation Japanese planners had never anticipated. The assumption that Japanese pilot skill and aircraft maneuverability would compensate for American material advantages was proving catastrophically wrong. Then came February 1944 and the raid on Truk, the Japanese stronghold that pilots had viewed with considerable apprehension. Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded Operation Hailstone with 6 battleships, 10 cruisers, nearly 30 destroyers, and 9 aircraft carriers deployed in 3 task groups. The F6F pilots realized they were sure to find good hunting. On February 17, 1944, Lieutenant Eugene Valencia from the USS Essex encountered attacking Zeros that pursued him miles out to sea, firing almost continuously without hitting him. The 22-year-old Californian decided they couldn't hit an elephant if it was tied down, and aggressively racked his Hellcat around to meet the assailants head-on. He gunned down 3 in short order, and the others disengaged and disappeared rapidly toward the horizon. Valencia returned to the Essex exultant after the mission, which made him an ace. His remarks, widely reported in the United States, summed up what most Navy fighter pilots felt about the F6F. "I love this airplane so much that if it could cook, I'd marry it." The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was profound. They were accustomed to fighting opponents who respected their capabilities, who approached combat cautiously, who understood the Zero's advantages. The Hellcat pilots showed no such deference. They attacked aggressively, absorbed hits that would have destroyed Zeros, and consistently came out on top in engagements. The mystique of Japanese air superiority, carefully cultivated since Pearl Harbor, was crumbling. And Japanese commanders knew it. Intelligence summaries from early 1944 paint a picture of an air force struggling to adapt. Tactical directives urged pilots to avoid vertical combat with the new American fighter. Squadron leaders emphasized the importance of maintaining energy states. Training syllabi were updated to include energy management concepts, but all of this ran into a fundamental problem. You can't teach experienced pilot skills to inexperienced pilots in abbreviated training programs. And Japan's training pipeline was collapsing under the strain of war. Pre-war Japanese pilot training was extraordinarily thorough, requiring 300 to 700 flight hours before a pilot joined an operational squadron. These men were elite aviators by any standard. But combat consumed them faster than the training system could replace them. The elite pilots who attacked Pearl Harbor, who fought at Coral Sea and Midway, who engaged in the brutal attrition over the Solomon Islands, were dead or too few to matter. By mid-1944, new Japanese pilots arrived at squadrons with 100 to 150 flight hours total. Some had as few as 40 hours. These barely trained aviators faced American pilots who averaged 300 flight hours plus extensive gunnery and tactical training. The qualitative gap was unbridgeable. The vertical fighting directives distributed throughout the fleet required skills that novice pilots simply didn't possess. Energy management, the ability to judge your aircraft's energy state and your opponent's energy state simultaneously while under combat stress, took extensive training to master. American pilots drilled these concepts repeatedly in stateside training squadrons. Japanese pilots were rushed through abbreviated training, shoved into cockpits, and expected to survive against vastly more experienced opponents flying superior aircraft. Some experienced Japanese pilots did adapt individually. Warrant Officer Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's top aces, described in his memoir how he modified his tactics after encountering Hellcats. He avoided climbing combat entirely, instead using hit-and-run attacks from favorable positions and immediately disengaging before American fighters could respond. But Sakai was exceptional, a survivor with over 500 combat missions. His tactics required judgment and skill that new pilots couldn't replicate. One veteran could adapt, but squadrons full of novices couldn't. The strategic situation made everything worse. By late 1944, Japan was fighting defensively across a contracting perimeter. Japanese fighters were forced into combat, protecting critical installations, shipping, and homeland approaches. They couldn't choose favorable engagement conditions because they had to defend fixed locations. American carrier task forces, by contrast, attacked when and where they chose, always with numerical superiority, always with the option to disengage if conditions turned unfavorable. Fuel shortages compounded every problem. Advanced pilot training requires fuel for flight hours. Japan's synthetic fuel production and dwindling petroleum imports meant training was cut even shorter. Operational squadrons received reduced fuel allocations, limiting their ability to maintain proficiency through practice. Some units couldn't afford training flights at all, meaning pilots only flew during actual combat missions. You cannot maintain edge-of-envelope skills, the kind of high-energy maneuvering required to exploit or counter vertical tactics, without regular practice. The final problem was psychological. Japanese naval aviation culture emphasized aggressive offensive spirit, the concept of fighting spirit. Tactical directives telling pilots to avoid certain types of combat contradicted deeply ingrained cultural values. Some pilots felt that refusing vertical combat was cowardly, that proper fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantage. This cultural resistance to defensive tactics meant some pilots ignored the warnings entirely and engaged Hellcats in exactly the vertical combat they'd been told to avoid. They died maintaining their honor, but they still died, and their deaths accomplished nothing except adding to the kill tallies of American aces. The stage was set for June 19, 1944, and what would become the most lopsided aerial victory in naval aviation history. June 19, 1944, dawned clear over the Philippine Sea, and what followed would become the most lopsided aerial victory in naval aviation history. The battle that pilots would forever call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was about to validate everything American carrier aviation had built toward for 2 years. Task Force 58, commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitchell, deployed 15 carriers with 956 aircraft, including 475 Hellcats. Opposing them, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet launched waves of aircraft from 9 carriers, determined to destroy the American invasion force off Saipan. The Japanese plan relied on shuttle bombing tactics, where aircraft would strike American ships, land at Guam or other Mariana airfields to refuel and rearm, then strike again on the return flight. It was an elegant concept that maximized their aircraft's range advantage. But the plan assumed Japanese pilots could fight their way through American combat air patrols, and that assumption would prove catastrophically wrong. American radar detected the first incoming raid at 1000 hours at a distance of 150 miles, giving Hellcat pilots time to climb to optimal interception altitude. Commander David McCampbell, leading the Essex Air Group, positioned his Hellcats at 25,000 feet, more than 3 miles above the ocean. When Japanese formations appeared below at 18,000 to 20,000 feet, American pilots held every advantage. They had altitude, they had radar vectors providing perfect positioning, and they had aircraft that could dictate the terms of engagement. The first wave of 69 Japanese aircraft hit American defenses like water against a dam. Hellcats dove from altitude, ripped through the formations with devastating gunnery passes, then climbed back to altitude while Japanese pilots tried desperately to respond. 0 pilots who attempted to climb after their attackers found themselves exactly where American doctrine wanted them. Low on energy, vulnerable, and unable to catch their tormentors, those who dove away to maintain speed simply took themselves out of the fight, unable to threaten American ships, while Hellcats controlled the altitudes above. Lieutenant Alex Vrasiu, flying from the USS Lexington, intercepted a formation of 50 Japanese dive bombers with minimal fighter escort. In a single engagement lasting 8 minutes, he shot down 6 aircraft, demonstrating the Hellcat's devastating effectiveness when properly employed. His tactical report described how he used altitude advantage to make repeated diving attacks, climbing away after each pass. While Japanese fighters struggled to respond, he never allowed himself to be drawn into turning combat, never gave his opponents the fight they'd trained for. The second Japanese wave of 130 aircraft fared no better. American fighter directors, watching radar plots, vectored fresh Hellcat squadrons into perfect interception positions. The Japanese formation fragmented under constant attacks from above. Pilots who tried to maintain formation discipline became predictable targets. Those who broke formation to engage individually lost mutual support and fell to coordinated American tactics. The vertical advantage meant American pilots could observe the entire battle developing below them, choosing targets and timing attacks for 50 maximum effect. Wave 3 consisted of 47 aircraft and Wave 4 numbered 82. Both met the same systematic destruction. By the end of June 19th, Japanese naval aviation had lost approximately 243 carrier aircraft and 50 land-based aircraft. American losses totaled 29 aircraft, with most falling to anti-aircraft fire rather than aerial combat. The kill ratio exceeded 10 to 1, and several Hellcat pilots achieved ace status in a single day. Ensign Wilbur Spider Webb shot down 6 aircraft. Lieutenant Junior Grade William Bill Stewart claimed 5. The names went on and on. June 20th brought a desperate Japanese retreat and an aggressive American pursuit. As Japanese carriers fled westward, American strikes launched at maximum range, knowing pilots would face nighttime carrier recoveries after exhausting their fuel. Hellcats escorted the strike packages, and when Japanese combat air patrol rose to intercept, American fighters used their now familiar vertical tactics. Japanese pilots, already demoralized and exhausted, broke off combat rather than accept engagements they knew they couldn't win. The two-day battle cost Japan over 600 aircraft and 3 carriers sunk. American carrier aviation had achieved absolute air superiority, and the Hellcat's vertical performance was the blade that cut Japanese resistance to pieces. But more than just the numbers, something fundamental had changed in the psychology of Pacific air combat. Japanese pilots who survived returned to their carriers with reports that must have seemed almost fantastical to commanders who hadn't witnessed the carnage firsthand. They described American fighters that seemed to appear from nowhere, diving with tremendous speed, delivering devastating bursts of fire, then climbing away before Japanese fighters could respond. They described being unable to pursue climbing American aircraft. They described watching their wingmen explode in fireballs from the concentrated firepower of 650 caliber machine guns. They described a new reality where every tactical advantage they'd relied on for 2 years had been neutralized. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Japanese naval aviation recognized the problem, but found themselves trapped by circumstances beyond their control. The warnings circulated, the tactical directives were issued, and experienced pilots understood they faced an opponent with superior vertical performance. But knowing you're outmatched and fixing the problem are entirely different challenges, especially when your industrial base is crumbling under Allied bombing and your pilot training pipeline has been devastated by 2 years of attrition. The most obvious solution would have been developing a new fighter to counter the Hellcat's capabilities. Japan did produce the Mitsubishi J4M, Raiden and Kawanishi N1KJ Shiden, both of which offered improved performance over the Zero. The Raiden could climb at 3,000 feet per minute and reach 380 miles per hour, numbers that finally matched American fighters. But production problems plagued both designs. The Raiden suffered engine reliability issues throughout its service life, with the Mitsubishi Kasei engine proving temperamental and prone to overheating. Only 476 were built during the entire war. The Shiden faced different problems. Despite being an excellent aircraft on paper, it was adapted from the Kawanishi N1K floatplane fighter, inheriting a complex landing gear design that caused maintenance nightmares. The aircraft didn't reach operational units until early 1944, and production never exceeded 1,400 units total. Even when these superior fighters reached frontline squadrons, pilot quality had degraded so severely that the aircraft's capabilities couldn't be fully exploited. A talented pilot in a Zero was more effective than a mediocre pilot in a theoretically superior Shiden. The training pipeline collapse was killing Japanese naval aviation more surely than any combat loss. By mid-1944, Japan's economy was in freefall. The American submarine campaign had strangled shipping lanes, cutting off oil imports from the Dutch East Indies. Synthetic fuel production couldn't make up the shortfall. Training programs that once gave pilots hundreds of hours of flight time were cut to the bone. New pilots arrived at operational squadrons with barely enough experience to take off and land, let alone survive combat against experienced American aviators. Doctrine couldn't adapt fast enough either. The vertical fighting directives distributed throughout the fleet required skills that novice pilots simply didn't possess. Understanding energy states, managing speed and altitude simultaneously, recognizing when you're in a disadvantageous position, and having the discipline to disengage rather than press an attack, these were skills that took hundreds of hours to develop. American pilots trained extensively in these concepts at stateside facilities. Japanese pilots were given abbreviated instruction, then thrown into combat where they learned nothing because they died in their first or second engagement. The strategic situation eliminated any remaining flexibility. Japan was now fighting a purely defensive war across a contracting perimeter. Japanese fighters had to defend fixed installations, shipping convoys, and approaches to the home islands. They couldn't choose when and where to fight. They had to engage whenever American forces appeared, regardless of tactical circumstances. American carrier task forces, by contrast, operated with complete strategic freedom. They attacked targets of their choosing, always with numerical superiority, always with the option to withdraw if conditions proved unfavorable. The psychological dimension of this transformation cannot be overstated. For 2 years, Japanese pilots had approached combat with confidence built on technical superiority and hard-won experience. They dominated the skies from Pearl Harbor to the Solomon Islands. Their aircraft were legendary, their tactics were proven, their pilots were elite. Now their own commanders were issuing directives telling them to avoid specific types of engagement with specific American aircraft. That's not adaptation, that's acknowledgement of inferiority. The cultural impact within Japanese naval aviation was profound. The concept of fighting spirit, the idea that aggressive offensive action and warrior mentality could overcome material disadvantage, was central to Japanese military culture. Tactical directives telling pilots to avoid climbing combat, to disengage when American fighters gained altitude advantage, to refuse engagement under unfavorable conditions. All of this contradicted deeply ingrained values about how warriors should behave. Some pilots couldn't accept these limitations. They engaged Hellcats in vertical combat despite explicit warnings, believing that skill and spirit would prevail. They died. Others followed the directives, avoided unfavorable engagements, and survived longer. But survival didn't mean effectiveness. A Japanese fighter that disengaged every time an American gained altitude advantage wasn't protecting anything. It was simply prolonging the pilot's life for a few more missions before the inevitable occurred. The mathematics of attrition were inexorable. Every engagement cost Japan pilots and aircraft it couldn't replace. The Americans lost aircraft too, but American factories were producing Hellcats faster than combat could destroy them. American training programs were producing pilots with hundreds of hours of experience. The gap between the two air forces wasn't narrowing. It was widening with every passing month. By late 1944, the disparity had become almost absurd. American carrier air groups were staffed with combat veterans who'd flown dozens of missions, accumulated multiple kills, and refined their tactics through hard-won experience. Japanese squadrons were filled with teenagers who'd barely learned to fly, thrust into cockpits of obsolete aircraft, and expected to fight experienced opponents in superior machines. The outcome was predetermined. The only variable was how long individual Japanese pilots would survive. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 provided the final demonstration of Japanese naval aviation's collapse. During the battle, Japanese carriers were used primarily as decoys because they lacked sufficient aircraft and trained pilots to conduct effective operations. The carrier force that had struck Pearl Harbor, that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, that had been the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, was reduced to sailing as bait to draw American forces away from more valuable surface units. This was the ultimate humiliation for an organization that had defined itself through carrier aviation excellence. Commander David McCampbell's performance during Leyte Gulf illustrated just how complete American dominance had become. On October 24, 1944, McCampbell and his wingman, Lieutenant Roy Rushing, encountered a Japanese strike force of approximately 60 aircraft heading toward the American carriers. With only 2 Hellcats against 60 enemy planes, the odds seemed impossible. But McCampbell and Rushing used every tactical advantage the Hellcat provided. They positioned themselves at altitude. They made disciplined diving attacks. They climbed away after each pass. They refused to be drawn into turning combat. They managed their ammunition carefully. By the time the engagement ended, McCampbell had destroyed 9 aircraft, and Rushing had destroyed 7. 16 Japanese aircraft shot, down by 2 American fighters. The kill ratio from that single engagement was 8-1. But more significantly, the engagement demonstrated that superior tactics, superior aircraft, and superior training could overcome almost any numerical disadvantage. Japanese commanders receiving reports from Leyte Gulf must have understood that the war was lost. When 2 enemy fighters could destroy 16 of your aircraft, when your pilots couldn't even force those two fighters into unfavorable combat, when every tactical advantage you once possessed had been neutralized or reversed, there was no path to victory. Only the manner and timing of defeat remained in question. The final months of the war saw Japanese naval aviation reduced to desperation. The kamikaze program, beginning in October 1944, represented the ultimate admission that conventional tactics had failed. If you can't survive combat with American fighters, if you can't penetrate American defenses, if you can't even force the enemy to accept engagement on your terms, then the only option left is to turn your aircraft into guided missiles and hope that suicidal determination can accomplish what skill and technology cannot. The kamikaze program was born from the ashes of the 19-to-1 kill ratio. It was the final answer to a question Japanese commanders had been asking since late 1943. How do we fight an enemy whose aircraft we cannot match, whose pilots we cannot train quickly enough to replace, whose industrial capacity we cannot compete with, and whose tactics we cannot counter? The answer was, we can't. We can only die in ways that might inflict some damage on the way down. When the war ended in September 1945, the Grumman F6F Hellcat's combat record stood as one of the most dominant performances in aviation history. 5,223 enemy aircraft destroyed in aerial combat. 306 additional aircraft destroyed on the take ground, all achieved at a loss of only 270 Hellcats in air-to-air combat. That 19-to-1 kill ratio represented the most lopsided aerial victory margin of any major fighter aircraft in the Second World War. No other fighter, not the Spitfire, not the Mustang, not the Messerschmitt 109, achieved anything comparable. The numbers weren't inflated by propaganda or overclaiming, though some of that certainly occurred. They were validated by multiple sources, confirmed through gun camera footage, corroborated by witness accounts, and verified against Japanese loss records captured after the war. The Hellcat had systematically destroyed Japanese naval aviation through a combination of superior design, superior tactics, superior training, and overwhelming numbers. Individual pilot achievements illustrated the Hellcat's effectiveness throughout the Pacific Campaign. Captain David McCampbell's 34 confirmed kills made him the Navy's all-time leading ace, a record that still stands today. Commander Cecil Harris finished with 24 victories, all in Hellcats. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia developed the mowing machine tactical formation, pairing fighters in mutually supporting elements that exploited vertical tactics to devastating effect, and finished with 23 kills. These weren't just talented pilots. They were tacticians who understood how to extract maximum effectiveness from their aircraft's capabilities. The Hellcat's operational versatility extended beyond pure air superiority. The F6F5 Newton's night fighter variant, equipped with APS-6 radar in a fairing on the starboard wing, hunted Japanese aircraft in darkness when previous night fighter attempts had proven inadequate. These aircraft destroyed 254 Japanese planes at night, providing 24-hour air defense for carrier task forces. The F6F5 could carry 2,000 pounds of bombs or 6 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, making it an effective ground attack platform. Some Hellcats operated as photo reconnaissance aircraft with cameras replacing guns. The basic airframe strength and reliability made all these roles possible. Production numbers reflected the Hellcat's strategic importance. Grumman's Bethpage facility produced 12,275 F6F Hellcats between 1942 and November 1945, when production ended just weeks after Japan's surrender. At peak production in March 1945, the factory delivered 605 aircraft in a single month, an average of more than 20 Hellcats per day. This industrial achievement meant American carriers never lacked aircraft regardless of combat losses. Every damaged Hellcat could be replaced within weeks, sometimes days. Japanese factories, by contrast, struggled to replace losses at all. The Hellcat's design philosophy influenced post-war American fighter development profoundly. The emphasis on vertical performance, energy management, and boom and zoom tactics became foundational concepts for jet fighter design. The Korean War's F-9F Panthers and F-2H Banshees were essentially jet-powered applications of Hellcat combat doctrine. Even modern fighter tactics still emphasize energy management and vertical maneuvering, concepts that Hellcat pilots refined into systematic doctrine during the Pacific War. Foreign operators used Hellcats extensively during and after the war. Britain's Fleet Air Arm received 1,263 Hellcats under Lend-Lease, operating them from escort carriers in the Atlantic and Pacific. The French Aéronaval flew Hellcats during the Indochina War. Uruguay's Navy operated them until 1960, making the Hellcat one of the longest-serving World War II fighters in active military service. These extended service lives testified to the aircraft's fundamental soundness and operational reliability. The human cost of Pacific air combat made the Hellcat's protective features as important as its performance. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented fires that had killed countless pilots in earlier fighters. Armor plating behind the pilot seat stopped bullets and shrapnel that would have been fatal wounds. The robust structure meant damaged Hellcats returned to carriers when other fighters would have gone into the ocean. Navy statistics showed that Hellcat pilots had significantly higher survival rates than pilots of any previous carrier fighter. And survival meant experienced pilots flew multiple combat tours, further multiplying American tactical advantages. Japanese pilots who survived the war acknowledged the Hellcat's impact in post-war interviews. Saburo Sakai, who lived to become one of Japan's most famous aces, stated that the Hellcat's introduction marked the turning point in Pacific air combat. Other Japanese veterans described the psychological impact of facing an opponent that controlled engagement terms completely. The warrior culture that had sustained Japanese military effectiveness for decades couldn't overcome fundamental material disadvantage, and the Hellcat represented that disadvantage in its most concentrated form. The warnings Japanese commanders issued to their pilots throughout late 1943 and 1944 painted a clear picture. Do not engage the new American fighter in vertical combat. Maintain energy and disengage if pursued in a climb. Avoid prolonged vertical maneuvering. These directives acknowledged what every surviving Japanese pilot already knew. The Hellcat had broken their aerial dominance, not just through superior performance, but through systematic exploitation of that performance in ways Japanese doctrine couldn't counter. The 19-to-1 kill ratio wasn't just a statistic. It was a measure of how completely American engineering, tactics, and training had solved the problem of Japanese air superiority. For 2 years, the Zero had terrorized Allied forces throughout the Pacific. Pilots climbed into their cockpits, knowing the odds were against them, knowing their aircraft were outmatched, knowing survival depended more on luck and tactics than on technical superiority. The Hellcat reversed that equation completely. Now Japanese pilots climbed into their cockpits, knowing the odds were hopeless, knowing American fighters outmatched them in every category that mattered, knowing survival was a matter of luck rather than skill. The psychological transformation this created cannot be measured in kill ratios or production numbers. It was visible in the desperation of kamikaze tactics, in the intercepted radio transmissions warning pilots to avoid engagement, and the after-action reports describing formations that disintegrated under American attacks, in the testimony of survivors who spoke of feeling helpless against an opponent they couldn't match. The Hellcat didn't just win the Pacific Air War through superior climb rate and firepower. It changed forever how air superiority fighters are designed, flown, and employed in combat. The principles it validated, altitude equals energy, energy dictates engagement options, vertical performance trumps horizontal maneuverability, disciplined tactics multiply aircraft advantages, became fundamental truths that shaped jet-age fighter development and remain relevant today. Every fighter pilot who learns energy management, every tactical manual that emphasizes boom and zoom attacks, every air combat engagement where altitude advantage proves decisive, carries forward the legacy of the Hellcat and the men who flew it. The F6F Hellcat's moment in history was relatively brief. From its combat debut in August 1943 to Japan's surrender in August 1945, just 24 months of operational service. But in those 2 years, It destroyed more enemy aircraft than any other Allied fighter, achieved the highest kill ratio of any major combat aircraft in the war, and broke the back of Japanese naval aviation so completely that the enemy resorted to suicide tactics as their only remaining option. That's not just a victory. It's dominance on a scale rarely seen in military history. When Japanese pilots radioed their commanders with warnings not to engage in vertical combat, when tactical directives circulated throughout the fleet acknowledging American superiority in climbing fights, when surviving pilots described being unable to pursue or escape climbing Hellcats, they were acknowledging a fundamental shift in the balance of power. The 19-to-1 kill ratio was the measure of that shift, and it was a ratio Japan could never overcome. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.